Published in 1862 to instant and lasting literary success, though begun some 18 years previously, Les Misérables has more recently found fame as a musical and has been filmed more than 20 times. By reflecting on various aspects of Victor Hugo's famous narrative, we hope to cast some light on the reasons for its immense appeal and success, particularly by analysing some of its major themes and characters. Jean Valjean was an honest man who, through force of desperate circumstance, committed the relatively minor crime of stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family, and paid a price out of all proportion with the severity of his crime. Captured and sentenced to a term of 5 years' imprisonment, Valjean spends 19 years doing hard labour as a result of 4 failed escape attempts. He emerges from prison on parole, a hardened and bitter man, having encountered little kindness in the course of these 19 years, and having adapted to the company he was forced to keep. Because of his criminal record, he encounters problems in finding employment, lodgings, and indeed any place in society. Exhausted and demoralised, he finds comfort and accommodation at the home of the Bishop of Digne, who shows Valjean kindness and compassion. However, during the night, Valjean surrenders to his experience and degradation of the previous 19 years, which, combined with a sense of hopelessness and worthlessness he has felt since his release, lead him to behave as he has been condemned to do. He steals the bishop's silverware. He is captured and returned to the bishop, who, contrary to Valjean's expectations, not only tells the police that he gave Valjean the silverware, but insists that Valjean should take 2 silver candlesticks as well. This is the first act of kindness and generosity Valjean has encountered in all those 19 years. Accustomed to having to fight for his very survival, this act of compassion and understanding, whose existence he has long since abandoned and then forgotten, causes him confusion and bewilderment. While still dazed by his meeting with the bishop, Valjean reacts once again in an animal-like fashion, doing what he feels he has to do in order to survive, when he steals a coin from a passing young chimney sweep. This act, contrasting violently with the kindness he has just been shown, brings home to him just what he has become and how far he has fallen. He determines to start a new life, adopting a new identity and a new mentality in the process. While Valjean is clearly the principal character, and our tale is largely concerned with his efforts to lead a worthwhile life, his destiny is inextricably linked with a whole gamut of characters whose lives become intertwined. This is equally the story of, among many others, Javert, the policeman who pursues Valjean in order to protect society from someone he regards as a dangerous criminal, Fantine, the tragic factory girl who sacrifices herself for the upkeep of her daughter, Cosette, the daughter of Fantine, used and abused by the innkeepers into whose care her mother entrusted her, the Thénardier, the self-centred innkeepers and petty criminals, Éponine, the daughter of the Thénardier and victim of unrequited love, Marius, an idealistic student who falls in love with the adult Cosette, and the revolutionary students who seek to incite rebellion against a heartless and uncaring government. The first point to make concerning the writing of the book is the fact that it is far from being a work of pure fiction. Indeed, it is based largely on historical fact, incidents lifted from Hugo's life, and characters Hugo met in the course of his life. The Bishop of Digne was based on a genuine bishop, and Javert was inspired by a high-ranking policeman of Hugo's acquaintance, Eugène François Vidocq. Valjean was based largely on the convict Claude Gueux, about whose life Hugo wrote a booklet, and doubtless several others Hugo met during his frequent prison visits. The adult Cosette is clearly based on Hugo's wife, Adèle, while Hugo himself served as a model for the love-struck young idealist Marius. The incident involving Fantine and the bourgeois she strikes is taken from a genuine incident witnessed by Hugo, in which a young prostitute was to be summarily sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment after striking a gentleman in self-defence. Hugo stepped in and explained the facts to the police, using his fame and position to help free her. By using genuine events and characters, then mixing them with situations and characters of his own fabrication, Hugo has created a particularly real and affecting story in which character traits are recognisable and convincing as his characters face a variety of challenging, though realistic, circumstances. It is especially by trying to evoke familiarity and emotional response that Hugo hopes to persuade his readers of the need for change in society at that time. To truly understand some of the main points of the story, I'm afraid a brief historical and philosophical digression is necessary. The 18th century was a time of philosophical turmoil and growing political unrest, with the increasing awareness of social injustice fueled by the published works of radical and challenging writers such as Voltaire, David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and René Diderot. The ideas contained in their works encouraged their readers to challenge the very core of society and its foundations, leading indirectly to the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, which form the backdrop and historical context for the events of Les Misérables. These events may well be considered a reflection of further political, social, and indeed philosophical change in the course of the 19th century, known broadly as the Enlightenment movement. This was a period of continued profound change in society, summarised perhaps by the move from faith and tradition to reason and social conscience. This was a society in revolution, as it veered from dogma, rigidity, and heartlessness towards a more human, caring, and tolerant approach. Hugo appears to suggest we recognise our responsibilities towards others, both individually and collectively as a society, and act upon this recognition. The world of Les Misérables is peopled by a vast array of characters whose destinies are intertwined. All are so well drawn that even if at first one has difficulty in seeing what import they will have for the narrative, one becomes interested in their story, perhaps before we are shown their connection to the main narrative. Hugo appears to be suggesting that our destinies are not set in tablets of stone, but are instead changed most profoundly by what may be chance encounters. People exercise influence on one another, but the key issue lies in the recognition of one's influence and the acceptance of responsibility for it. Valjean feels he is responsible for Fantine's fall from grace and sets out to make amends by taking her daughter Cosette under his wing. Taking the argument one step further, Valjean endeavours to ease the burden of the less fortunate by undertaking good deeds, the building of schools and hospitals, and providing a good standard of pay for the benefit of the common people, thus helping them to avoid situations such as he and Fantine have known. If Les Misérables is a plea for and a symbol of philosophical, social, and political change, nowhere is the difference between the old and the new better encapsulated than in the clash between Javert and Valjean. Javert is frequently viewed as Valjean's evil adversary, but this is a quite erroneous and simplistic interpretation. He is a highly principled and well-intentioned officer of the law, but he is dogmatic and rigid in his thinking. He may well represent the Ancien Régime, with its authoritarian and hierarchical, if ultimately divisive, approach to government, based on the principle of the superiority of the wealthy ruling class who believed they had divine authority to govern. Valjean, on the other hand, may represent the Enlightenment movement, which invited people to question the very existence of God, morality, and therefore the very authority of those in power. Valjean is no revolutionary. He deals only with the people and events which touch him personally. Yet he represents a danger to the established order because he has learned to challenge the traditional view of justice, both legal and social, as a result of his imprisonment and his encounters with a variety of characters. He offers an alternative to traditional thought in the form of reason, as opposed to dogma, and the promotion of compassion and humanity, as opposed to a rigid social order. Jean Valjean is the product of the society he lived in, both in terms of the social conditions that led to him stealing a loaf of bread and the excessive sentence he received as punishment for his crime. He went into prison a simple and devoted brother and uncle, and left it filled with despair, hopelessness, bitterness, and anger at the injustice of his treatment. He also became accustomed to doing whatever was necessary to survive, with little thought of dignity and principle. Thus, in reflex acts of desperation, he stole from the bishop and the young chimney sweep. These acts, in direct contrast with the kindness shown to him by the bishop, cause him to focus on what he has become, the very creature he was accused of being all these years before, and which he has resented for so long. This realization, combined with the realization that any man could suffer what he has suffered as a result of social injustice, inspires him to treat people with tolerance and understanding. He has seen what can become of men as a result of their circumstances and experience, and is determined to help others by providing a reasonable standard of living for the workers in his factory and the creation of a caring community through the construction of schools and hospitals. It should be noted, however, that it was only as a result of his act of theft, his imprisonment and degradation, and of course his pivotal encounter with the bishop, that he developed into this wise and selfless benefactor. Apart from experience and the people whose paths we cross in our travels, our identity is dependent on our character. And what sets Valjean apart from others who might have shared similar experiences is his determination not to allow the bitterness of the past to cast its shadow on the future. This, combined with a willingness to act responsibly for his actions, allows him to accept the past, learn from it, and go on to help others avoid situations similar to those he has encountered. Nor would he have become this man without having met Monseigneur Myriel, the Bishop of Digne, whose kindness saved and inspired him. It is essential to note that an ordinary man serves as Valjean's inspiration. It is not God. It is not because he is a man of God, but it is a man displaying extraordinary kindness in exceptional circumstances whom Valjean takes as his inspiration. And it is this kindness and understanding that he, in turn, will show to others he perceives as being in need. Valjean has become an independent thinker. He professes a belief in God, but does not spend his time pondering the unfathomable and waiting for divine inspiration. What defines Valjean is the fact that he has learned from his experience and acts on it. He tries to help people by his own initiative. He sees what is needed, takes control, and sets about creating circumstances which will help resolve the situation. There are any number of examples of Valjean's heroism, a willingness to help others even at his own expense, all inspired by love and a sense of responsibility. Yet these acts are tinged with and accentuated by tragedy, as that Valjean is driven not only by a sense of responsibility, but by a lack of self-respect. He is motivated by the need to compensate for his misdeeds of the past. He is ashamed not so much of the 19 years he spent in prison, but rather that on his release he was willing to prey on those weaker than himself in order to survive. He has seen his own dark side. He has seen what he could become in the right circumstances, and he knows that suppressing this selfish creature to selflessly help others requires effort and determination. However, he remains a prisoner of his past and decides to withdraw largely from Cosette's future in order to protect her from potential disgrace and embarrassment. Valjean undertook to care for Cosette out of a sense of duty. That is now fulfilled, as her husband will take his place as her protector. And as he has no legal or moral right to remain in her life, it is better to protect her and withdraw. Valjean ended up in prison as a result of the questionable system of justice in operation at the time, which leads Valjean to doubt the fairness and validity of the system of justice and indeed the very foundations of the structure of society. Deprived of hope and freedom, these doubts turn to bitterness and resentment. It is only after meeting the bishop that Valjean is able to see a way forward to help others who might also have fallen foul of a society which was not always sensitive to the needs of all of its members and was dismissive of those who committed any infringement of its rules, with no heed given to circumstance and no offer of compassion or understanding. Both Valjean and Javert spent a considerable length of time in the Bagne, the penal colony. Valjean as a prisoner and Javert as a warder. In Javert's case, he was born in prison as his parents were both criminals. He has therefore grown up in an environment where the laws of the land are held as sacrosanct. Inmates were sent there to learn respect and acceptance of the law, and so there was no room for discussion or debate. In this environment, there was also a clear division between them and us, the plunderers of society and its protectors, thus encouraging an unequivocal attitude with right being clearly on one side and certainly not on the other. One even wonders if Hugo saw prison as a metaphor for society itself, with the imposition of its rules and restrictions, and more importantly, the imposition of a frame of mind which cannot function out with these rules and regulations. Thus convinced of his parents' wrongdoing, Javert sets out to prove himself worthy of society's appreciation rather than its condemnation. He is determined to rise above his background and pursues his ambition through a rigid application of society's rules, which he accepts totally and without question. This is in stark contrast to Valjean, who learns to question the nature of justice in society and appreciate the value of tolerance through his experiences, while Javert is determined to uphold the values of society without recourse to thought and consideration. Both, then, wish to help and make a worthwhile contribution, though in markedly different ways. Javert seeks to protect society from the criminal element, while Valjean has first-hand knowledge of what can bring problems about and sets out to help avoid these problems. For Javert, society remains something of an abstract notion, while Valjean is more concerned with the individuals who make up society. Fantine is known to both Valjean and Javert. Valjean feels responsible for her situation and is determined to help her as he feels he has contributed to her fall from grace by allowing her to be fired from his factory. Javert has also played a part in her degradation by arresting her on flimsy grounds and insisting on imprisoning her for 6 months. The fundamental difference in attitude between them brings them into conflict, yet both are doing what they consider right and just. Valjean recognizes his responsibility towards her and wants to act to alleviate her suffering, while Javert is interested in protecting society from what he sees as an irredeemable criminal. Javert has total faith in the system of rules he represents, and, by extension, total faith in himself. Unfortunately, he is a man who allows his faith in his principles to overwhelm him. There is no place for doubt, thought, or understanding in his world. Valjean, on the other hand, doubts and questions himself at virtually every turn. His strength of will is derived from the fact that he feels he has seen his own black side. He knows what he is capable of, given the right circumstances, and because he has seen an alternative, he is determined to avoid any repetition of this black side. When Valjean releases Javert at the barricades, Javert is forced to call into question his own judgment and that of the whole of society. Javert, however, doesn't have the tolerance or forgiveness to accept his own mistakes and move on. He sees that he may have been mistaken in his judgment of Valjean, but because his philosophy is based on application of rules rather than thought and consideration, he sees no way forward for himself. Doubt may lead to clarification, but Javert sees no alternative to his principles, which he has just seen overturned. He has, in effect, lost faith in his own ideals and cannot accept an alternative based on nothing more than respect for his fellow human beings. Valjean's transformation and redemption are underpinned by love and tolerance, qualities which Javert fails to embrace in his life. Javert cannot understand a world without guidance or some kind of standard set by a higher power. He hasn't enough love or respect for others to see that a system of conduct and morality may be based on humanity. For him, there must be some authority, and when that authority is challenged and is shown to be fallible, the whole basis and purpose of his life is shattered. Hugo prefaces his book with a statement in which he says that as long as there remains ignorance and misery on earth, books such as his will not be useless. He also suggests that many of the problems facing men, women and children in society are created by the very laws and traditions of that society. By working together and showing understanding and tolerance toward one another, great things may be achieved. However, the result may be quite the opposite if divisive and arbitrary laws and customs are introduced and accepted by those who stand to gain and who may hold the balance of power. Society in 19th century France appears to have been sharply divided between the haves and the have-nots, with the ruling bourgeois class happy to make as much profit as they could from the relatively poorly paid but hard-working factory workers who saw healthy profits go into the pockets of the middle-class owners, while the common people struggled to get by on the pittance they were paid. Although conditions had improved to some extent since the French Revolution, the aristocracy had been replaced by the middle classes, who undoubtedly aspired to the position and power of the late aristocracy, and they proved little better in terms of the provision of living and working conditions for the working class. In his book, Hugo sets out to depict circumstances and situations to challenge the thinking and attitudes of the time. He was particularly preoccupied by the issue of the appropriateness of the punishment to fit the crime, the social reasons that may lead to crime in the first place, and of course the treatment of inmates in prison. Hugo took a keen interest in cases he considered miscarriages of justice, and indeed he was inspired to produce a booklet about the case of Claude Gueux, a convict executed by guillotine in Troyes in 1832. Hugo's telling of his story reveals a far more morally complex case than is suggested by a rapid look at the facts of the case. He gives us a picture of an unemployed man who burgled a house to steal bread in order to feed his starving family. Captured, he was condemned to several years' hard labour and was persecuted by one of the warders, who told Gueux his wife had resorted to prostitution to make ends meet, and, seeing he had forged a special friendship with one inmate in particular, he separated them. He refused to reunite them even after Gueux pleaded with him, and so, pushed beyond his limits of endurance, Gueux committed the act for which he was eventually guillotined, the murder of his warder. Clearly, Gueux's story contains some of the base elements of Les Misérables, and in telling his tale, we see an early example of Hugo's preoccupation with justice and society. In many ways, this is an early feminist work, presenting a sympathetic and admiring picture of women and what they have to tolerate in society. This is exemplified by Fantine and her suffering. She is seduced and then cold-heartedly dropped by her bourgeois boyfriend. Pregnant, she must find a means of supporting herself and her child in a society that dismissed unmarried single mothers as scum. In order to obtain a job, she must entrust her daughter to the care of a couple she meets on her travels. At this time, there was no social security, no welfare system, and no adoption checks. It was a matter of survival, and it was each man or woman for him or herself. Through Fantine, Hugo bemoans the plight of young women and unwanted pregnancies, and condemns society for its superior and hypocritical moral stance. Eventually, Fantine loses her job because of her child, and she is forced into prostitution to pay for the upkeep of her daughter. She has therefore been transformed by society into the very thing it haughtily accused her of being in the first place. Through young Cosette and also Gavroche and the young chimney sweep, we see the abuse of children apparently abandoned by parents and who are virtually slaves, deprived of education and forced to work long and arduous hours for an often unsympathetic master. Again, Hugo implies criticism of society in tolerating these conditions and practices towards children. It is particularly in its depiction of love and ultimately its appeal for tolerance that Les Misérables excels. Love is perhaps the key theme in the book. Love is depicted in many different forms and is shown as the principal means of fulfillment and redemption. In the Bishop of Digne, we see pure spiritual love. The bishop is entirely devoted to God and his works. He is determined to see only the potential good in man, believing this to reflect God's wishes and intentions for mankind. The bishop follows the spirit of the Bible, not the letter of the written word. He has within him a love for God, but also an innate love for man, according him a respect not always shared by others. He is an optimist and sees himself merely as an instrument of God's will. Fantine represents maternal love and the lengths to which a mother may be prepared to go in order to protect and save her child. Although she abandoned her child, Cosette, this was done with the best of intentions and was the result of pressure applied by society in the form of prejudice and hypocrisy. She is, in her way, devoted to her child and is willing to sacrifice her own wealth, health, and dignity in order to protect and save Cosette. In Marius and the adult Cosette, we see youthful passion and undiluted love. They are totally devoted to one another to the point of being able to think of little else. Their youthful exuberance causes problems in other areas of their lives. Marius appears, until the last minute, more concerned with Cosette than with helping his friends on the barricades, and Cosette begins to question her father's authority. Cosette, like Esmeralda in Notre-Dame de Paris, serves as a catalyst for events and emotions. Also like Esmeralda, her character is perhaps less important than the emotions she provokes in others and the events for which they, in turn, are responsible. Neither Cosette nor Esmeralda actually contribute a great deal to the advancement of the narrative, but serve instead as the inspiration for others. In Éponine, we see the tragic consequences of deep but unrequited love. Éponine is devoted to Marius, but his heart belongs to Cosette, and he is hardly aware of Éponine's existence beyond that of a friend. Éponine's love for Marius takes on heroic proportions when she dies at the barricades, having selflessly delivered a message to him from Cosette. She dies wishing to be near her love, and it is this love which has led her to escape the self-centered mentality of her parents, the Thénardier, and commit selfless acts of love and devotion. In Valjean, we see a man who has all but lost his self-respect, and who is tempted to become the creature others accuse him of being. He is saved by one man's kindness and compassion, and sees that there is another way to lead one's life, based on respect and love. Love to Valjean is essentially a spiritual affair. He has no physical loves, but gives of himself quite freely, allowing others to maintain the self-respect and dignity he himself had lost. He shows paternal love for Cosette, and even before that he shows devotion in stealing bread to feed his sister's child. Sadly, he has little or no love for himself, choosing instead to devote himself to the provision of materials for others. He considers himself a thief, unworthy of others' affection, and spends his life trying to redeem himself in his own eyes. Although he has been twisted by his experience in prison, Valjean is saved by love and shows that love combined with determination can lead to change in man and also, by extension, in society. In the students on the barricades, we witness love of a different sort, love of a cause. They put belief in a principle above their own self-love. So immersed are they in the battle for social justice that they are willing to lose their lives to act as examples for others to follow. Valjean and Javert, though poles apart, share a belief in something greater than themselves. Thénardier, however, appears to believe in nothing, and is a prime example of warning of the dangers of egotism and a refusal to recognize the needs and rights of others, whether through plain humanity or respect for values based on God's reported word and morality. Perhaps the most interesting and complex character when viewed from the point of view of love is Javert. While the others are driven principally by love, Javert is driven mostly by duty. Love, and by extension respect for others, is an alien concept to Javert. Indeed, he appears to be striving to gain or maintain some degree of respect throughout the book. He endeavours to achieve this through applying the letter of the law which was flouted by his own mother and father. In many ways, he resembles Valjean. He is faced with similar problems of trying to live with his past, and he is driven by a sense of duty. What is missing is any feeling of love, for himself or anyone else. An openness to respect and love would have allowed him to see man's potential for good, but his upbringing and consequent attitudes have denied him that possibility, and he chooses to commit suicide rather than face the errors of his past and attempt to change. If love is a key theme of the book, its overall purpose is surely a heartfelt plea for tolerance and understanding. Hugo raises awareness of various aspects of society which contributed to the gulf separating the haves from the have-nots, and perpetuated the cycle of division and resentment which fired thoughts of rebellion and social revolution. These problems were based largely on intolerance and a lack of willingness to recognise the common thread of humanity we all share. We are all responsible for the society which we share by virtue of the fact that our actions or inaction impact on others. In the course of his book, Hugo discusses, among other examples, living and working conditions, social reasons for committing crime, the treatment of convicts, and the plight of ex-convicts who seek to rehabilitate themselves in society, the frustration of working women and the victimisation of those who fall foul of society's moral code, and of course the abuse of children deprived of education and forced into virtual slavery. Perhaps the best and most touching example of political intolerance lies in the killing of the rebellious students on the barricades. These are idealistic young men who seek to improve the lot of common working people. This is in stark contrast to those in positions of authority willing to profit by others' efforts, but who refuse to acknowledge the plight or concerns of the common people. Death is the ultimate demonstration of our lack of control over our destiny. Whether it's by God's will or through force of circumstance, most of the characters meet their end in the pursuit of their principles or in the name of love, except Javert, who seeks his own death as a result of the overturning of his principles. Their death can be seen almost as a reflection of a positive aspect of their character, though ultimately their death may have no positive effect, calling into question the meaning and value of life in the broader sense. What matters is what each person has made of his or her life and the worth they have given it through their actions. Most of Hugo's characters, including Fantine, the students, Éponine and Gavroche, die as a result of selfless love, and their actions and motivations are to be admired. In the end, Valjean dies of a broken heart, the result of his selfless devotion and heroic actions to promote Cosette's happiness. This is in stark contrast to Javert's death, which, while tragic in its own way, is ultimately a selfish act and reflects a life lacking love and genuine respect for others. Valjean devotes his life to bringing up Cosette. She becomes his focus, his purpose, his entire life. She can also be viewed in broader terms as representing the future of society. Children are the key to the future, and it is the responsibility of those living in the present to endeavour to improve the lot of those who will eventually inherit society and what we have made of it. Parenthood is central to Les Misérables, not just in the shape of Valjean doing his best to bring up the young Cosette, but its importance is emphasised through Fantine and her selfless devotion to her daughter, the negative influence of Thénardier on his offspring, the void left in Marius's life created by never knowing his father, his relationship with his grandfather, whom he calls father, and the shame Javert feels concerning his own parents. Valjean's own early life is affected by the death of his parents, and he more or less takes a place as head of the family when his brother-in-law dies. Hope is present also, and perhaps more obviously, in the very fact that Valjean recognises his shortcomings and problems and shows great resolve and selflessness in his pursuit of redemption. The suggestion is clearly that we need not submit to our circumstances or past experience. The human spirit is such that, given strength of character, determination and sensitivity to the plight of one's fellow men, everyone is capable of extraordinary feats of compassion and tolerance. There is a humanity pervading Hugo's characters. We feel his descriptions more closely resemble observations of genuine personalities rather than products of his imagination. Their thoughts and feelings are familiar to us all. Hugo describes each of his characters in extraordinary detail. They are not simply used by Hugo to advance a narrative, which appears at times almost sidetracked in favour of exploration of the characters who people it. We are made aware of the life and background of each of these characters so that it becomes more and more difficult to react simply to an action or judge it when we have come to understand their motivations and inner feelings. Hugo is frequently accused of digression from the narrative, and this is fair criticism. In later editions of the book, Hugo's lengthy digressions on Parisian slang and life in convents were relegated to appendices. And while his descriptions of the Battle of Waterloo and the sewers of Paris remain an integral part of the text, it must be said they offer little in terms of advancement of the narrative. The very descriptions and characterizations, so rich in detail, which allow the reader to empathise and reflect on various aspects of life, can also be tedious and frustrating, as the progress of the narrative is sacrificed for increased knowledge of and understanding of the characters. Hugo also adopts a certain moralising, almost paternal tone with his readers. He has very set ideas about what he wants to say and where he wants to lead his readers, and frequently overstates a case to convince them, perhaps because he feels he has considerable prejudice to overcome. If the reader can overcome resistance to the style and learn to appreciate what is there, he will find it a most rewarding and stimulating experience. Hugo was first and foremost a poet. He was a wordsmith who used symbolism and imagery to express ideas and lend clarity and poetic beauty to the events and characters he describes in Les Misérables. Just about the best-known event of the story of Les Misérables is the giving of candlesticks to Valjean by the bishop. The significance of the candlesticks goes well beyond their monetary value and the very fact they were given to him. They may be seen symbolically as lighting Valjean's path through the darkness of his past to the path of goodness. Indeed, he is following a path when he meets the chimney sweep, the path to self-destruction as he steals the boy's coin, but he chooses a different path, and therefore a different way of life, when he realises what he has done and symbolically tears up his yellow passport, thereby turning his back on his past. When he builds his highly successful business and becomes mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer, it is under the name of Monsieur Madeleine. Surely the resemblance to Mary Magdalene is more than accidental. She too was saved from a life of sin by a good man. When Valjean meets Cosette for the first time and he lifts her water bucket, he is also alleviating her life of other burdens. He is lightening her load with his friendship and help. Les Misérables contains some profoundly spiritual aspects, discussion of duty, conscience, humanity, etc. Hugo is also, however, clearly opposed to ecclesiastical dogma. He appears to believe firmly in the power of the spirit and a code of morality based on humanity. He also appears to believe in God, and may even be suggesting that dogma and tradition have derailed man from the true path of godliness and goodness. In keeping with this, it has frequently been suggested that Valjean may be viewed as something of a Christ figure. Valjean was a woodcutter by trade. He goes to an inn on Christmas Eve to see a child who is going to change his life. He appears to have no association with the opposite sex, but has a relationship, of sorts, with a prostitute. He even manages to rise from the dead at one point. Though Valjean is not their leader, the students may be seen as disciples, and clearly Javert represents the accepted and threatened order of things. Valjean is no superhuman or heaven-sent figure. Indeed, his appeal is in his decidedly human nature. He is the product of society, events, choices, and of course his own character. His acts of heroism are accessible to us all, and can thus serve as a source of inspiration for us all without necessary recourse to the ultimate form of moral authority. Valjean may believe in God, but he does not depend on him for inspiration or authority. He does what he feels he has to do, based on compassion for the benefit of others. As such, he is a model for what can be achieved in society without necessary reference to the Church and its orthodox concepts of morality. Hugo believed in the perfectibility of man. He believed that man could rise above his experience to achieve selfless acts of kindness. In Valjean, we are presented with a model for such change which appears entirely feasible as we can trace its evolution, but change which requires enormous willpower and determination. It is based on humanitarian inspiration leading to spiritual enlightenment, while ecclesiastical, political and legal dogma are rejected. Les Misérables is often accused of being over-dependent on coincidence, and this is undoubtedly true. The Thénardiers seem to crop up quite regularly and are links common to most of the main characters. It is with the Thénardier that Fantine leaves the young Cosette. Later in Paris, the neighbour happens to be Marius, who is in love with the adult Cosette, and with whom the Thénardier's daughter Éponine also happens to be in love. Of course, Marius feels he owes a considerable debt to Thénardier, who was credited with saving his father's life at the Battle of Waterloo. The lovable rogue Gavroche is their son, and 2 children Gavroche finds in the streets of Paris happen to be their offspring as well. Being in the criminal fraternity, the Thénardier have come to know Inspector Javert, who has also come to Paris to advance his career. While escaping through the sewers after the failed coup, Valjean encounters not just Thénardier, but Javert as well. On the surface, it certainly appears true that the book contains an excess of coincidence. But is Hugo not using these events to accentuate points about the existential nature of our lives? These characters' lives are inextricably linked to one another. Each has played and continues to play a vital, indeed formative role in the other's lives. He may be overstating his case, but Hugo is emphasizing the fact that our lives are not just linked, but are dependent on one another. Given what they stand for, it is inevitable that they will clash, and this is the other reason why coincidence is not overly damaging to the whole. The main characters can be seen as metaphors standing for conflicting principles, and so the clash is less between the characters themselves than between their points of view. Let us not forget that Hugo was a poet, using metaphor and symbolism to make his point. Indeed, that the book is accused of an excess of coincidence is a tribute to the strength of the writing, since the characters are so individual, well-drawn and realistic that we find probability stretched beyond what we find acceptable. However, the point is that we all influence one another and we all share a common bond by virtue of the fact we share our society and indeed our lives. There have been many attempts to bring the story of Les Misérables to life, with well over 20 cinema adaptations and of course the world-renowned musical. The quality of the cinema versions has varied considerably, naturally enough, with writers and directors focusing on certain elements often at the expense of various others. In general, the fuller the adaptation, the more successful it is. However, to my great surprise, I have found the musical by Boublil and Schoenberg, produced by Sir Cameron Mackintosh, to be the most successful adaptation I have seen. The 1934 cinema version, starring Harry Bohr, remains, and I suspect will always remain, my favourite. The key to Les Misérables is love, and the 1934 version succeeds in appealing to the heart better than any other I have seen. It is undoubtedly melodramatic in places, but this is perhaps a style which is not unsuitable for the recounting of Hugo's tale, and this may explain why more modern and realistic versions have fared less well in transferring the story to the big screen. This may also account for the inordinate success of the musical, which appeals to the heart and spirit. In my opinion, the musical version of Les Misérables is the perfect union of base material and medium. Above all, as I've said before, Hugo was a poet who wrote a book about society's ills, injustice, and the ways in which we, humanity, treat one another. He deals with a huge variety of themes, but to achieve his goal, he tries to engage emotion, invite reflection, and perhaps more than anything else, incite compassion and serve as inspiration. Music is far and away the most effective means of communicating emotion and imparting a sense of compassion and love. Music can make you feel in an instant what it might take many words to impart, and if the key to Les Misérables is emotion and compassion, surely the most effective means of expressing the story is in music. This is, I think, why Les Misérables has been so successful. The music and storyline complement one another perfectly to provide an adult and reflective entertainment which touches the hearts of its audience and which inspires them to think about their own lives. This musical has touched many people's lives. It has inspired many and continues to affect those who have seen it, and for considerably longer than the duration of the show itself. It is an achievement of which Boublil, Schoenberg, Sir Cameron Mackintosh and all those involved in its production and performance can be rightly proud. It is also a rendering of which I imagine Victor Hugo would heartily approve. My thanks for listening and viewing. I hope you've found our work of interest and perhaps even useful. Goodbye.